The United States ambassador to Canada walked into a room full of farmers in Toronto today and admitted something that no diplomat is supposed to say out loud. Pete Hoekstra, the man whose entire job is to manage the relationship between the two largest trading partners in the history of the North American continent, stood at a podium at the Canadian Crops Convention and told the audience that Washington and Ottawa have not had a single substantive conversation about trade since October. Not a negotiation, not a working session, not a phone call that amounted to anything real. Nothing substantive in 5 months, with a $1.9 trillion trade agreement heading toward a mandatory review deadline on July 1st, and the clock ticking louder every single week. And then he said something even more revealing. He said, and these are his exact words, that the United States is facing headwinds in the negotiations. Headwinds. That is the word the American ambassador chose to describe the state of the most important bilateral trade relationship the United States has on the planet, with a deadline that every economist, every supply chain executive, and every auto industry analyst in North America has been watching with increasing alarm for the last 18 months. This is where the story starts, because it tells you everything about how Washington is treating a deal that supports 30% of global GDP, 14 million American jobs, and a supply chain so deeply integrated that a single car assembled in Michigan can have its parts cross the US-Canada border 6 or 7 times before the vehicle is complete. Let's lay out the numbers so you understand the actual scale of what is sitting on this table. The United States-Mexico-Canada Agreement, known as USMCA in Washington and CUSMA in Ottawa, governs $1.9 trillion in annual goods and services trade between the three countries. That number comes from Citi Global Perspectives and has been confirmed by the Center for Strategic and International Studies, the policy magazine analysis from February 2026, and Baker McKenzie's independent review published the same month. $1.9 trillion. For comparison, the entire economy of Italy, the eighth largest in the world, is approximately $2 trillion. The North American trade corridor that USMCA governs is, by itself, an economic bloc the size of a G7 nation. And North America as a whole, as the size analysis notes, represents 30% of global GDP. This is not a regional trade dispute. This is the architecture of the world economy, and it has a mandatory review date of July 1st with no substantive negotiations currently underway. Here is how the review mechanism works, because most people do not know this, and the details matter enormously. USMCA was built with what analysts call a sunset clause, officially Article 34.7 of the agreement. 6 years after the deal entered into force, which was July 1st, 2020, all three countries, the United States, Canada, and Mexico, must sit down and formally decide what happens next. If all three agree in writing to extend the deal, it continues for another 16 years until 2042, with a new review in 2032. If any single party declines to confirm extension, the agreement does not immediately end, but it enters a decade-long series of annual reviews that could drag all the way to a scheduled termination date of July 1st, 2036. Any party can also trigger a full withdrawal by providing 6 months written notice at any point. Trump's own trade representative, Jamieson Greer, told Congress in a report submitted in January 2026 that a rubber stamp of the 2019 terms was not in the U.S. national interest, and that the administration was keeping all options open, including exit. And Trump himself said it out loud. Earlier this year, during a visit to a Ford facility near Detroit, Trump called USMCA irrelevant while arguing the United States does not need Canadian or Mexican vehicle production. The same man who signed USMCA in 2020 and called it the best trade deal ever negotiated, the deal he said was great for all countries, is now privately asking his own aides why he should not simply withdraw from it. That reporting came from the deep dive in February, citing officials briefed on internal White House discussions. The president's view, as Greer explained it publicly, is that he only wants deals that are a good deal. And the reason USMCA was built with a review period, Greer said, was in case they needed to revise it, review it, or exit it. That is the context in which the American ambassador admitted today that nothing substantive has been discussed since October. Now let's talk about what this means for the United States and why the Americans at risk here are not diplomats or politicians, but workers, manufacturers, and anyone who buys a vehicle, a refrigerator, or a house with aluminum windows. The automotive sector is the clearest example because the numbers are staggering. The USMCA corridor, according to a cross-border trade volume index tracked by financial analysts, saw a 4.2% dip in the first quarter of 2026 alone as shippers began rerouting some traffic to purely domestic lanes in anticipation of potential border disruptions. That is before anything actually changed. That is just the uncertainty doing damage. A single new car assembled in the United States today has parts that cross the US-Canada border an average of 6 to 8 times during production. Engine components, transmission parts, electrical systems, aluminum body panels. The supply chains are not just connected, they're fused. There is no American auto industry without Canadian inputs, and there is no Canadian auto industry without American assembly. If USMCA collapses or enters annual review chaos, every vehicle crossing the border would immediately become subject to the standard World Trade Organization tariff rate of 2.5%. That sounds small until you multiply it by hundreds of components crossing multiple times, and you begin to understand why Ameriprise Financial's research team wrote publicly that the renegotiation could inject significant volatility into markets and disrupt the normal planning for new car models and the securing of raw materials like aluminum and steel. Ford alone absorbed $900 million in tariff costs in the second half of 2025 under the current partial tariff regime. That was with USMCA still nominally in place. Remove the agreement entirely, and the calculation becomes catastrophically worse. And this is where today's admission by the ambassador becomes something more than a diplomatic embarrassment. There is a calendar problem. Baker McKenzie, one of the largest trade law firms in the world, noted in their February 2026 USMCA review series that the three governments were supposed to submit their recommended changes to the agreement for the Free Trade Commission to consider by June 1st. June 1st is the deadline for proposed amendments. July 1st is the review meeting itself. Today is March 12th. That leaves approximately 11 weeks before the amendment submission deadline, and the American ambassador just told a room full of Canadian farmers that Washington has not had a substantive conversation with Ottawa since October. Hoekstra did not pretend this was normal. He acknowledged the headwinds directly. He said he thinks both sides want to get to an agreement, but that restarting talks was, in his words from November, not going to be easy. He has also, in separate appearances, accused Canada of meddling in American politics through Ontario's anti-tariff advertising campaign, delivered a profane tirade at a Canadian-American Business Council gathering that multiple witnesses described to CBC News, and told a Halifax audience he was disappointed by what he described as the Canadian election being an anti-American campaign. This is the diplomat responsible for the most important bilateral trade relationship in North America, 11 weeks before a deadline that will determine whether that relationship has a legal framework for the next 16 years. Canada, for its part, is not sitting still. Prime Minister Mark Carney, who took office in March, declared publicly that USMCA had been effectively broken in the short term by U.S. actions. His finance minister, Dominic LeBlanc, has not backed down from the retaliatory tariff posture that escalated through February and March. And Canadian businesses are making structural decisions right now that tell you more about where this is headed than any diplomatic statement. According to Global News, the number of Canadian companies selling exclusively to the United States has been cut nearly in half since the trade war began. 65% of Canadian exporters surveyed said they're actively pursuing new markets outside the U.S., with a target of completing those transitions within 2 years. Quebec's aluminum industry, which sent 95% of its production to American buyers as recently as 2024, has signed long-term supply contracts with European buyers. Those contracts do not get undone easily or quickly regardless of what happens at the July review. The Canadian government also sold $3.5 billion in American Treasury bonds to investors this week. That is not a catastrophic number in isolation, but it is a signal, a deliberate and public signal, from a government that is managing its exposure to American assets in real time while its ambassador is being told in Toronto that talks have stalled for 5 months. The consequences of USMCA failure were spelled out clearly by the Center for Strategic and International Studies in their August 2025 analysis. Energy cooperation would take an immediate hit. The agreement provides protections for cross border energy investments and facilitates the flow of electricity, natural gas, and refined products across both borders. Canada supplies roughly 15% of total U.S. electricity needs in certain regions. Ontario's threat earlier this month to impose a 25% tariff on electricity exports to Michigan, New York, and Minnesota, which was only withdrawn after Trump escalated steel tariffs to 50% and then rolled them back within 48 hours, showed exactly how fast energy becomes a weapon in this dispute. Agriculture faces renewed uncertainty under a USMCA breakdown. Integrated supply chains that allow North American farmers to export livestock, grains, fruits, and vegetables across borders would face tariffs, inspections, and inconsistent standards. The size analysis described the result plainly: higher food prices for consumers and lower margins for producers, ultimately risking the region's food security. There are three outcomes possible at the July 1st review. First, all three parties agree in writing to extend for 16 years. Second, one or more parties declines to commit, triggering the annual review cycle through 2036 with no certainty. Third, a party provides 6 months withdrawal notice at any point before or during the process. Analysts at Miller Law, who published a detailed review of the options in January 2026, noted that if the United States does not get what it wants, the threat of walking away will be on the table. And Trump has already demonstrated he is willing to use that threat. He said the review was built in case they needed to exit it. His trade representative said a rubber stamp is not in the national interest. His ambassador admitted today that nothing substantive has been discussed in 5 months. The irony that cuts through all of this is that Trump negotiated USMCA himself. He signed it in 2020. He called it a historic achievement. He described it as the largest, most significant, modern, and balanced trade agreement in history. 6 years later, his own ambassador is standing in Toronto telling Canadian farmers the talks have stalled. His own trade representative is telling Congress a straight renewal is not the goal. And the president is privately asking his staff why he should not just walk away. 17 million North American jobs are supported by trade under this agreement, according to Inter-American Dialogue analysis. North America is trading $1.8 million per minute under the current framework, according to Miller Law's January 2026 figures. The automotive corridor alone carries hundreds of billions in annual value. And the deadline for the three governments to submit their proposed changes is 11 weeks away, with no substantive negotiation currently scheduled between Washington and Ottawa. Pete Hoekstra flew to Toronto today and told a room full of farmers that America and Canada have not had a real conversation about trade since October. He called it headwinds. What it actually is, measured in the only units that matter to the American worker, the American manufacturer, and the American consumer, is $1.9 trillion sitting on a table with no one currently negotiating. A July 1st deadline approaching at full speed, and a president who built this deal now asking privately why he should not tear it apart. That is where this story stands tonight, and it is moving fast.